the PowerPoints coming up, I have to pause and wipe my nose. Boy, this time of year is just a killer. I woke up this morning about 5:30, felt like a Mack truck sitting on my head. We get this change of weather. It's rough. So those of you who are fellow sufferers understand. Okay, Matthew 14, and we're going to look at what I've called two amazing miracles, and we'll see how far we can get. Let's start with reading about the first one, and this is Jesus feeding the 5,000. I want to start reading with verse 13. Let's go down to verse 21. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. And when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them, and he healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." And Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here to me," he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and he broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. And they all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. And the number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So in this first one, Jesus is feeding the 5,000. It starts off that he has heard about John's beheading. And we were told in the earlier section that John's disciples came to him and told Jesus about that. The author, Matthew, doesn't say this, but it says when Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. You get the impression, if you're reading between the lines, this had a tremendous impact on Jesus. And so it is, and here's the interesting thing. If you watch Jesus' ministry, and for example, follow it closely just through the book of Matthew, there are some pretty emotional times during Jesus' ministry. If we're not careful, we tend to think of Jesus as this divine Son of God who came from heaven, and we forget that he was also fully human. His ministry was full of all kinds of emotional rides up and down. And I think this was one of those down times when John's disciples came and told him. I've often wished that we had that conversation when they came to Jesus. How did they describe it? What did they tell him? Whatever they said and however they described it, it had that impact on him. Judy?
We forget a lot of times the relationship that Jesus had with John.
Yeah.
John and Jesus were very, very close, not necessarily physically, but spiritually.
Yeah.
Because of the Holy Spirit being in John.
Mm-hmm.
And John, of course, was his cousin, 6 months older than Jesus.
Yeah.
And he was the one who was preparing the way for Jesus. And Jesus knew every instant of his ministry. And of course, John was the one that baptized him.
Yeah, yeah.
And John was the one that many of his disciples had been following. And so this was an extremely difficult time for Jesus.
It was.
As well as, I think, spiritually.
Because of what you said, think of all of the conversation back and forth between Jesus and John, and they're keeping up with each other that we don't have. That would be interesting if we had all of those recorded conversations, how they kept up with each other. But because of what you've said, that really underscores how emotional This must have been for Jesus. And so he withdraws then to a solitary place. It's interesting in the Gospels if you note those times and situations that drive Jesus to a solitary place. Think about in your own life, things that have been so emotional, really huge issues to deal with. I remember recently someone told me of an event that happened in their life that was so emotional that they were in the car when they found out. Well, they said they pulled off kind of like into a little picnic area and just cried and sobbed in their solitary place, but it was in a car at that moment. We all have those solitary places where we have to process very difficult things that come up. And if you follow Jesus in the Gospels, it's interesting when he is sort of driven to those solitary places, and this is one of them. Now, notice that the crowds followed him. Do you remember, some of you were in the Wednesday night class when we went through the Gospel of Mark, and I'm trying to remember the title of that whole Wednesday night series, but it was something like Hearing the Voice of Jesus. And one of the things that we noted in the Gospel of Mark, because Mark seems to really highlight it, and it's all through the Gospel, is Jesus' interaction with the crowds. And the thing that's interesting about Jesus and his view of discipleship is that, and this was really interesting for me to hear when I had been in ministry for just a few years and really struggling with different levels of relationship. Milton Jones, who used to preach up in Washington, way up in the northwest part of our country, wrote a little book, and it's a little blue book, and I can't remember the title of it. But I remember in this little blue book that he wrote, there were these concentric circles. And he started off with Mary and Martha, his very closest ones, and Peter, James, and John. Went from there to the 12, and then the 70, and he just drew these concentric circles of relationships that Jesus had with others. And the fascinating point that he made was, Jesus didn't spend the same amount of time with everybody. He just couldn't. But at every level of relationship, no matter where it was in that circle, Jesus was always faithful to nurture and tend to those relationships from a perspective of kingdom values. And that really helped me, because I think at that point in my early ministry, I felt like there was something wrong with me because I wasn't able to spend the same amount of time with every person. And like, well, that's impossible. You can't do that. And of course, we know that. So we have to have a set of priorities that guides us in how we spend the time that we do with people, and realize that faithful discipleship is modeled by Jesus. You've got the people closest to you. You have to be faithful to that. Then the next circle, then the next circle. All of us have those kind of relationships, and we have to be faithful to those. So the crowds are following Jesus. And I think one of the things I remember noticing as we were going through that, many, many times, the crowds came to Jesus for a couple of reasons. One, on occasions it looks like a free meal. Number two, they were just as curious as they could be because they had heard reports about Jesus. And there were some people who said, well, we want to see you do all these miracles. And they were just waiting for something amazing just to see Jesus do it. Here's what fascinates me, is that Jesus didn't drive people away even when they came with wrong motives. I like that. We need to learn from that. Sometimes we think that if people don't have the right intent and motives, and we sort of find that out, well then, okay, I'm cutting my relationship, all that person, move on. But that's part of, it seems to me, individuals growing. That maybe you're coming to Jesus with perhaps the wrong motives and intent, but as you grow in discipleship, those motives become more God-honoring and more priority of kingdom values. I'll give you an example. I've got a couple of friends who have been in the ministry for a number of years, and they love to tell the story that how they got introduced to the church was coming to Vacation Bible School as a teenager where all these cute-looking girls were. So their original motive and intent was to date someone, and it's interesting how God had a bigger picture, and of course they grew and matured in their motive and intent to follow the Lord. And I know all of you have heard those kind of stories. It's amazing how God works through that. So Jesus then had compassion and he healed their sick. I was reading recently that a Christian writer said this: of all of the dimensions of discipleship, the one that he considered was the most important to be like Jesus was our ability to show compassion. Probably all of us at a certain level have failed at that. We can look back on times where, I wasn't as compassionate as I needed to be then. But here's and I'm thinking about this, and see what you all think about this. Sometimes we confuse compassion with enabling people. That somehow we feel if we're in a position to help hold someone accountable, that means we're not being compassionate. And that's not true. Sometimes the most compassionate thing is to help hold someone accountable spiritually so they can grow. It's hard, but if you truly have a heart of compassion for people, you're going to not do things for them, but walk alongside them and help hold them accountable. And I think some people confuse those two. That if I step forward and I'm trying to help this person grow and mature, and the conversation gets maybe a little strained and I have to hold them accountable, that I'm no longer being compassionate. Well, that's not true. Those are not exclusive. But Jesus had compassion on the crowd and he healed their sick. This is an interesting statement. There are various reasons why Jesus performs miracles. And it's interesting because there are times when he performs a miracle and the gospel writer doesn't tell us why. But given the context, you can kind of guess why. Here, it's explained very clearly. Jesus healed sick people often out of his compassion for them. And in English, we kind of make a distinction, and this is probably a good example for this. If I tell you that I have empathy for someone, the way we use the word, you don't pick up on the idea that I'm doing anything. It's just that I kind of feel for them. But if I use the word compassion, it tends to carry the idea that I'm actually stepping forward to do something because I feel for them. And that's kind of the way we use the two words. Though from the etymology of both words, there's no difference in meaning. But how we use them, I think, is a little different. So if think about this. What if Matthew had recorded this? He had empathy for the crowds. And then that was the end of the sentence. Well, yeah, he would have felt for them. But with this compassion, he steps forward and he does something. And I think there's something here that we need to make the connection with. Compassion compels me. Compassion compels me to do something. And when we're compelled to do something, I've often thought, and this is a powerful thing to think, and I love to bring it up. When you feel that urging to do something, and let's say it's motivated by compassion, we need to recognize that may very well be the specific answer to a prayer somebody else has been praying. And it was years before that thought ever entered my brain. And that's how come we need to take this seriously. What I am doing out of compassion may be the specific answer to a prayer that God's using that someone's been praying. Now, the difficult part of that is often God doesn't let me know who's doing the prayer. I have no clue who's praying the prayer. And that's okay, because discipleship means there's a lot of things I don't know. And God doesn't give me the privilege, pulling the curtain back and seeing what's going on behind the scenes. But he wants me to be faithful to that.
So in other words, you have more compassion for these type people.
Oh, yeah.
Keeping everything right and specific.
That's exactly right. And remember, twice already in Matthew, we've picked up on that, haven't we? Where Jesus says, I desire mercy more than sacrifice. Think about this for a moment, because we've already touched on a little bit in Matthew. And Jesus says it in kind of a neat way. When Jesus approaches some of the deeply embedded traditions that have really kind of gone awry, he says, now, what I'm not saying is for you to not tithe your mint and cumin and all that stuff. He said, I'm not saying throw that out the window, but what has happened is you've got things turned around. And Jesus is trying to get people to see that the things you do flow out of a heart of compassion, and that you don't see religion as just a checkoff list, and that you size up people and you determine that they're not worth anything if they're not checking off the list like you are. I mean, that's what got Jesus in trouble. And it's just amazing to me that for all of the time that the church has been in existence to the time of Jesus, there is the human tendency to create some of this list of faithful things that if I can do them, then I feel good, but if you don't do them, oh, shame on you. You're not where you need to be. I am, but you're not. And we miss the whole point. Loving God with all heart, soul, strength, and mind, and loving our neighbors ourselves. And as Johnny mentioned, this whole fundamental thing of desiring mercy and not sacrifice. So it's really crucial to be aware of that difference. So Jesus' ministry, both with his healing and the way that he approached people, was based on compassion. And as you're reading through the book of Matthew, it makes you raise this question about yourself. And so I have to raise it for myself, and you have to raise it for yourself. Am I as compassionate as I need to be? If I claim that I'm following the steps of Jesus, am I compassionate? And does that compassion move me to action? And see, we can only answer that personally for ourselves. Now, if we feel like that we haven't been, we can step up to a brother and sister and say, look, I'm not doing so well here. I need for you to pray for me. We can do that, but unless people tell us specifically, we don't know what the answer to that is for each human heart, but we have to ask it. And I put down here, note that compassion is an essential dimension of being a disciple of Jesus. This would be interesting. I thought about this. The first of the year, if you'd have had a list of resolutions for the new year, if you had told yourself this year for 2018, I want to be more compassionate. And if that was one of your resolutions, how do you think that would need to look? What would that need to look like in your life? If you resolved within your heart, Lord, this year in 2018, I know I need to grow in my expressions of compassion, so I want to be more compassionate. What would that look like? I just think that's a neat thing to think about in our own spiritual growth. And notice as the evening approaches, the disciples came to Jesus because they're in a remote place, kind of out in the wilderness. It's remote. It's getting late. And so the disciples think that they have an answer to this. Jesus, if you would just send the crowds away, then they could go get what they need. At this point, they don't see themselves being part of the solution. They thought the solution was just send them away. Now here, oh boy, we need to talk about this a little bit. It is so tempting in living the Christian life to be approached with a problem And if we're not careful, our immediate knee-jerk reaction is to say, somebody else can help you. Just leave me alone. Take care of that. Go, go, go. Yeah, Bill?
I think that sometimes if we look for the simplistic answer instead of being the involved answer.
Oh, yeah, what a great way of saying it. We look for the simplistic answer instead of the involved answer. Well, because think of what involvement means. It means it's going to take some of my time. It may take a little bit of money out of my pocket. I'm going to have to get involved and care. It's much, there's more at stake here if I'm involved.
If the disciples did not say, what can we do?
No, they didn't. No, that's why I said, they had their perceived answer to this dilemma, but it wasn't like, let us be the solution. Yeah, Judy?
Place, they didn't have food for all these people.
There was no 7-Eleven there.
Nope.
There wasn't a McDonald's out there,
So now wait a minute, Judy. So you're saying that most of us would have responded like the disciples?
Yes.
Yeah, you're probably right. You're probably right. Well, and here's what's neat is, and I think this one of the reasons that, there's several reasons that this narrative is painted in the picture of Jesus. I think one of them is that as disciples, we need to recognize that when things come up like this, if we're not careful, we can only see the solution from our human perspective. Physical human perspective. Because, I think you're exactly right. Had we been with the disciples, we would have said the same thing. So Jesus is going to come along and he's going to say, well, now wait a minute. And I like what he does. See, he gives them the challenge. They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. That thought had not entered their mind. What do you mean? We give them something to eat? We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. So, well, yeah. It was, yeah. And what's interesting, Matthew doesn't tell us about the little boy here, does he? We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Jesus said, bring them here to me. So here's what's interesting. They've done an assessment, and still it's on a physical, external level. They've done an assessment. Here's all we got. Jesus said, well, bring it here. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. And so taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now here, I think I mentioned this. Let me see if I put this on here, because this is interesting. Yeah, we have here only. I hear in that word desperation. What are you talking about? This is all we got. Bring them here to me. He directed the people. Now, look at this. Looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves and gave it to the disciples, and they gave it to the people. This expression of looking up into heaven, giving thanks and breaking loaves would have been understood, and in the history of Christian interpretation in the early church, it was viewed this way. This is to resonate and resurrect language related to the Lord's Supper. And that's interesting to think about that, because we think about what? Giving thanks, breaking bread. That's often language attached to Lord's Supper. No.
You could fix a lot of sandwiches with 5 loaves of bread.
Yeah.
This was 5 small loaves of bread for a little boy's lunch.
Yeah, he obviously would have had to carry them, so it's not much. And what you're going to see as a model here that is raised up all through the Gospel of Matthew is that no matter what we have, we just finished chapter 13 with this idea. No matter how small it is, what we bring to the table, the kingdom table, God can use it in ways we can't even imagine and make its influence spread and his power accomplish things that we can't. And I think this was I thought about this. If some of you are familiar with the historical figure Ignatius of Loyola, there's a thing that came out of a lot of his teaching called Ignatian spirituality. And here's what he would say, that as you're reading through the narratives of the New Testament, in your time of meditation, imaginatively and creatively, step into the shoes of one of the characters. Now, and I was thinking about that this morning. I said, now, can you imagine, first of all, the young man whose lunch was used? And for him to watch that being multiplied. Step into the shoes of the disciples. Be one of the 12. And I've often thought, how in the world, I mean, my brain's always tried to get around that. How in the world could you actually see 5 loaves continually supplying? You know, and I don't know if the disciples went back to the basket, took out some loaves, they went back and it was still full as if they'd never taken one. I don't know how that looked, but you know good and well it was doing a number on their mind. So you step into their shoes. What would the disciple, I mean, this is an amazing teaching moment for these guys. Yeah, Bill?
The lesson is still as impressive as it's ever been. Years ago in one of the vacation Bible schools that we did, this was one of the incidences that we used as a storyline. And we had the man trained Jesus tear up the paper loaves and fishes and put them in a basket. When the basket was served to the children, but as the disciples turned around, they stuck that paper up their sleeve. And in that basket were oyster crackers and goldfish crackers.
Okay.
And the expression of one little boy in the front row was, "How did he do that?"
I could see that being the question on the lips of the disciple. How did he do that? So think about this. Their view from a purely physical plane and trying to figure out things in their mind, Jesus has superimposed that, and he's coming at this situation from a transcendent experience, one in which it totally created a whole new category of thought for them, that's for sure. And expanded their worldview in terms of what God can do with what they think is not adequate for the situation. And think about how that becomes then a model for discipleship and how we're to view the work of God in the world. When we bring a little bit to the table, it's amazing what God can do with it.
The song we used to sing years ago, the song was "Little is Much When God is in it."
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's been years since, little is much if God is in it. Exactly. I forgot about that hymn. Yeah, we used to sing that one. Great song. Okay, one more minute. Then notice that they all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. There was more left over at the end than what they started with. You almost get the impression this is saying God just dumped so many blessings on them they had no way to hold it. And again, a visual demonstration of the provision of God. And we'll end with this comment. I know in your own Christian life, you have seen through the years visual demonstrations of God's provision that went way beyond what your mind thought could ever be possible. Well, we'll pick up there again next week. Thank you all for being here.